Imagine paying money to touch a woman's body. As scientists watched and took notes, they called it science. History calls it horror. This is the untold story of the woman Europe tried to erase the real-life Hottentot Venus. In the gas-lit exhibition halls of 19th century Europe, under velvet curtains and the glimmer of chandeliers, thousands of people gathered not to marvel at art or the wonders of technology, but to gawk at a human being, displayed like an exotic animal in a cage. They stood shoulder to shoulder, eyes wide with morbid curiosity, whispering and pointing, their breaths quickening as they laid eyes on a young woman whose only crime was being born with a body that defied European standards of beauty. Sarah Bartman, known to the crowds as the Hottentot Venus, became both a star attraction and a prisoner trapped between the world's hunger for spectacle and the cold calculations of what passed for science. Her story is not merely a dark footnote in history. It is a devastating, shocking truth about how entertainment, pseudoscience, and racism converge to destroy a human life, with a cruelty that still echoes into our time. In an era obsessed with human zoos, where colonialism and scientific racism fueled Europe's sense of superiority, Sarah's body became a battlefield, a commodity to be sold, a canvas onto which white society projected its deepest fears and desires. Her humanity was erased, replaced by labels and measurements by the relentless gaze of audiences who paid for tickets just to see her curves, her difference, her supposed link between the civilized and the savage. This isn't just dark history, it's a wound that still festers in our collective memory, reminding us how easily human dignity can be stripped away when prejudice meets profit. And as we unravel Sarah Bartman's untold story, we're forced to ask ourselves, who gets to decide who is fully human, and how far would we go for the price of a ticket? In the waning light of the 18th century, as empires carved the world into maps colored in blood and gold, Europe stood atop the globe, proclaiming itself the pinnacle of civilization. This was the age when kings and scientists spoke in the same breath about progress and humanity's grand destiny, all while colonialism sank its claws deeper into distant lands. The streets of London, Paris, Berlin shimmered with gas lamps and wealth, but beneath the glow lurked an insatiable hunger, a desire for the exotic, the unfamiliar, the other. It was this hunger that would devour Sarah Bartman. They called it curiosity. They called it science. But what it truly was spectacle. Europe in the early 1800s was a world possessed by a singular obsession, the categorization of human life into hierarchies that placed white Europeans at the top and all others somewhere far below. This was the dawn of scientific racism, a monstrous machine of measurements, skull calipers, and so-called anthropological studies. The same scholars who wrote lofty treatises on reason and enlightenment scribbled notes comparing African features to animals, desperately trying to prove that black bodies were inherently primitive. It was not merely prejudice, it was an intellectual system built to justify empire slavery and the violent stripping away of entire cultures. Even the most respected institutions, universities, museums, learned societies became accomplices in this grand deception. They cloaked their curiosity under the noble banner of science, transforming human zoos and freak shows into educational exhibitions. Audiences poured in, eager to glimpse people ripped from their homelands and placed behind glass as living proof of Europe's supposed superiority. The untold story behind these shows is how they blurred the lines between entertainment and oppression, profit and pain. For a handful of coins, the public could confirm their deepest racial myths, safe in the knowledge that they were the masters of the world. It was an era of contradictions so stark they cut like knives. Enlightenment philosophers preached equality while investing in slave ships. Artists painted visions of liberty even as entire continents were shackled under colonial rule. The same salons that debated democracy hosted private performances where black bodies were displayed for wealthy elites. And within this swirling hypocrisy, a terrifying idea took hold that some human beings existed purely to be looked at, measured, owned. It was a belief that would turn women like Sarah Bartman into commodities sold not once, but over and over in the currency of spectacle and shame. To the European gaze, Africa was not a continent of kingdoms, languages, and ancient civilizations. It was a canvas painted black, wild, untamed, primitive. From dusty lecture halls to raucous taverns, conversations about Africa were drenched in images of savagery and sexual excess. The public wanted to believe that Africans were closer to beasts than men, and nothing served this fantasy better than the display of real human beings. This was dark history, but to Europeans of the time, it was entertainment. The emerging science of the day, comparative anatomy, craniometry, phrenology, provided a convenient alibi for the European conscience. Men in white coats with cold eyes would measure lips, hips, buttocks, insisting they were documenting the secrets of humanity. In truth, they were fortifying the bars of a racial prison one measurement at a time. And the horror is not only that these scientists existed, but that society revered them. Their findings trickled down into newspapers, sermons, school books embedding racism in history with a permanence that would echo into future centuries. In this climate of obsession and exploitation, the Khoi people of South Africa caught Europe's fascinated gaze. Known for distinctive physical features, they became, in European eyes, living specimens of a racial curiosity that demanded to be seen, touched, dissected. The shape of their bodies, the language they spoke, the way they danced, all were transformed into evidence of inferiority. Their humanity disappeared under layers of spectacle and science. Sarah Bartman was born into this vortex of greed and ideology. Her life was not destined to be merely her own. From the moment of her birth, her body was marked as property, a resource to be extracted, exhibited, exploited. Every continent Europe touched bore scars, but for Sarah the price would be uniquely brutal. She would become flesh and blood proof of the monstrous theories that kept empires standing. The road that led her from the green valleys of the Eastern Cape to the cruel spotlights of Europe began here in a world determined to transform her humanity into a shocking truth for crowds eager to stare. But Sarah's story was never just her own. It was forged in the fires of history, in the relentless collision between empire and identity. And to truly understand how one woman could become the symbol of an entire continent's subjugation, we must first step into the brutal crossroads of Cape Town at the dawn of the 19th century, a place where cultures collided and where Sarah Bartman's fate was about to be sealed forever. In the unforgiving sun of South Africa's Eastern Cape, the land once bloomed with green valleys and winding rivers alive with the footsteps of the Khoi people who called it home for countless generations. Their villages stood where the wind carried songs instead of gunfire, and the earth yielded not only crops, but stories. These were communities bound by kinship ritual and an identity as old as the continent itself. Yet history had already marked this place for conquest, and as European ships sliced the ocean horizon, the fate of the Khoi people and of a young girl named Sarah Bartman began to darken. The Dutch were the first to come, driven by hunger for land and profit. In the 1600s, they planted their flags and claimed the soil as the Cape Colony, sparking a chain of violence that would echo for centuries. They brought disease muskets and an ideology that saw the Khoi not as equals but as obstacles, or worse, as curiosities. Herds were seized, villages were burned, and the very names the Khoi gave to mountains and rivers were replaced with words in a foreign tongue. Cape Town, by the dawn of the 19th century, had become a city of cruel contradictions. Its harbor teemed with ships flying British and Dutch flags, unloading cargoes of silk, spices, and human beings. This was not only a crossroads of commerce, but a crucible where lives were bought and sold under the indifferent gaze of colonial administrators. The streets bustled with traders, soldiers, slaves, and travelers who whispered tales of the exotic savages in the interior. Here, colonialism wasn't a distant policy, it was the air itself. For the Khoi, the arrival of Europeans was not merely political, but deeply personal. Families were shattered as fathers were killed in commando raids. Cattle, the core of Khoi, wealth and culture, were stolen in violent sweeps. Entire clans were driven from ancestral lands, forced to seek refuge among strangers, or be swallowed into systems of forced servitude. The untold story of this time is that the same scientific minds who would one day measure Sarah Bartman's body were already measuring her people's worth in gold cattle and colonial profit. Sarah Bartman was born around 1789 into this shifting, dangerous landscape. In the Gamtus Valley, surrounded by rolling hills and the rhythm of Khoi life, she would have grown up hearing the soft, clicking sounds of her mother tongue, learning songs and dances passed through generations. But the encroaching tide of colonialism would soon sweep away any chance of a peaceful childhood. Her father was killed in one of those brutal raids, a statistic in the larger ledger of conquest. The trauma of that loss would mark the first fracture in Sarah's world. Before Europe displayed her body, it destroyed her home. By her teenage years, Sarah was living in servitude, working on a Dutch farm owned by Peter Caesars near Cape Town. There she performed endless labor beneath the same sun that once lit her valleys. To colonial authorities, she was property, another asset to be exploited. And yet, in a cruel twist of fate, it was precisely her body, the same body that bore the scars of servitude, that would draw the attention of men who saw profit where others saw humanity. Cape Town's European community buzzed with rumors of the exotic beauty of Khoi women, particularly noting features like steatopegia, the genetic trait leading to an accumulation of fat on the buttocks. This natural variation, unremarkable within Khoi culture, became an object of fetish and fascination in European eyes. It was whispered in taverns, speculated upon in salons, and scrawled into scientists' notebooks. To many Europeans, the Khoi woman was a living paradox, evidence of both supposed primitivism and forbidden allure. This was the earliest seed of the human zoo that would become Sarah's prison. The city itself was the perfect breeding ground for such exploitation. Sailors carried tales of distant lands, merchants chased new profits, and scientists hunted living proof for their racist theories. Cape Town offered all of them an intersection of opportunity, a chance to transform a woman's body into both scientific specimen and commercial spectacle. Sarah Bartman was about to become that opportunity. In Cape Town, the price of a human life depended on how many people would pay to look. Even as she labored under colonial rule, perhaps Sarah dreamed of freedom. Perhaps she believed that somewhere beyond the horizon, there was still a life untouched by violence and cruelty. But the same forces that shattered her childhood were assembling to steal even that hope. The men who approached her in Cape Town, men like Hendrik Caesars and Alexander Dunlop, offered escape, wealth, and fame. But in truth, they were offering a one-way passage into a different kind of cage. A cage with velvet curtains, bright lights, and thousands of staring eyes. And so as Sarah stood in the shadow of Table Mountain winds whipping across the bay, her story teetered on the edge of an irreversible decision. A decision that would carry her across oceans, into the gaslit streets of London, and into the pages of dark history. Because the next chapter in Sarah Bartman's life was waiting in the heart of the British Empire, where crowds paid in silver to witness what they called the missing link. And where Sarah would discover that freedom was just another word men used when they wanted to own you. In the restless swirl of Cape Town's colonial streets, rumors traveled faster than ships. Merchants spoke of gold, sailors bragged of distant lands, and somewhere amid the din, two men spotted an opportunity, a young woman whose body might command a price higher than any cargo. Sarah Bartman, already burdened by a life of loss and servitude, found herself standing on the cusp of an offer that glittered like salvation, but would become the cage that finally closed around her. One of these men was Hendrik Caesars, possibly a relative of her employer Peter Caesars. The other was Alexander Dunlop, a British ship's doctor whose curiosity extended far beyond medicine. They told Sarah tales of London, of stages bathed in gaslight, of audiences who would pay fortunes to see her perform. They promised her a share of the profits, a better life, freedom, a chance to escape the drudgery of working under the colonial yoke. In their words, she would be a star, an exotic wonder in the greatest city on earth. But freedom in the colonial lexicon was often just another word for ownership. They sold her a dream. What they delivered was a spectacle. Sarah was living in a world where consent was not truly possible for a woman like her, a black woman, a servant, a colonial subject. Even if she nodded her head, even if she said yes, how free could that choice really have been? Historians still debate whether Sarah went willingly or under coercion. But this much we know: the power was never hers. The decision belonged to men who saw in her body not her humanity, but the promise of pounds sterling. Fade-in map from Cape Town to London with ships sailing across the ocean. Overlay coins falling symbolizing profit. The ocean voyage that carried Sarah away from the shores of Africa was more than just a journey between continents. It was a passage between two worlds, one where she belonged to a land, a people, a language, and another where her identity would be rewritten as exotic spectacle. On deck, salt spray stung her face and the sails cracked overhead, carrying her toward a future none of her ancestors could have imagined. Perhaps she thought of the Gamtus Valley of green hills, of songs sung in the Khoi tongue, or perhaps she tried not to think at all. Across Europe, whispers of the Hottentot Venus began to circulate even before Sarah set foot on British soil. London's entertainment entrepreneurs were hungry for dark history, anything that would shock and enthrall the public. The appetite for the human zoo had never been greater. It was a world eager to feed on difference, to stare, to point to profit from the spectacle of bodies labeled other. Sarah's defining physical trait, steatopygia, the genetic accumulation of fat on her buttocks, became the focal point of her new identity. What was simply a natural variation among Khoi women became in European eyes evidence of both animalistic traits and sexual allure. In taverns, men whispered crude jokes. In salons, scholars speculated about evolutionary hierarchies. In newspapers, headlines hinted at scandal. Her body had become news before she even arrived. She hadn't yet set foot in London, but London had already decided what she was. Sarah disembarked in 1810 into a city roaring with industry and ambition. The streets pulsed with carriages, markets, and voices speaking in accents from every corner of empire. But beneath London's wealth lay a darkness eager for shocking truths, and the thrill of the forbidden. Her arrival was not announced as the coming of a woman with dreams and sorrows. It was billed as the arrival of an exhibition. Old London newspapers spinning into frame, bold letters, Hottentot Venus arrives. Alexander Dunlop and Hendrik Caesars wasted no time preparing for her debut. They arranged for posters, contracts, and carefully scripted performances. Her new identity was printed in ink for all of London to read, the Hottentot Venus, a title soaked in racism and eroticism, combining a slur for her people with the name of the Roman goddess of beauty. It was branding as bondage. Behind the scenes, debates began over how Sarah should be presented. Would she appear in traditional attire, beads, and animal skins, feeding the public's hunger for the untold story of savage lands? Or would she be costumed in tight, flesh-colored fabrics designed to outline her form while maintaining a veneer of decency? Either way, the aim was the same: to turn her body into profit and her existence into a true crime of history. And yet, in these early days in London, Sarah might have still clung to hope. Maybe she believed she would perform songs from her homeland. Maybe she thought she could earn money to return home one day. But hope is a fragile thing, under the weight of chains both visible and invisible. The stage that awaited her was not one of celebration. It was a cage built from the eyes of strangers and the relentless machinery of a society determined to keep her small. Sarah Bartman left Cape Town seeking freedom. What she found was London, because the next chapter of her journey would take place under chandeliers and gaslights before audiences who came not to applaud, but to stare. Her body would become a battlefield for Britain's racism in history, for the spectacle industry's greed, and for the pseudoscientific vultures circling her every move. The show was about to begin. London in 1810 was a city exploding with ambition and greed. Smoke rose from factories, the clatter of carriage wheels echoed over cobblestones, and the River Thames carried whispers of trade and empire. This was the beating heart of a nation that claimed to be civilized, and yet lurking beneath its wealth and progress was a darkness eager for spectacle. Into this world stepped Sarah Bartman, a woman whose body would become both her prison and the hottest ticket in town. From the moment Sarah arrived, posters began to appear across the city. Bright sheets pasted to brick walls, screaming sensational headlines: "The Hottentot Venus, a living curiosity, only 2 shillings." The same streets that hosted Shakespearean theaters and orchestras now promised audiences a new forbidden thrill: the chance to stare at a woman described as part human, part exotic enigma. In London, Sarah Bartman became less a person and more an event. Her first exhibitions were staged at 225 Piccadilly Street, a building that would soon become a theater of humiliation. Audiences paid 2 shillings, a price equivalent to about $30 today, to step into a dimly lit room where they found Sarah on a raised platform. She was dressed in tight, flesh-colored garments meant to cling to every curve, highlighting her figure, while giving just enough illusion of decency to avoid scandal. But there was nothing decent about what took place. Dark room spotlight hit Sarah standing alone, a sea of faces below leering. The crowd watched her walk back and forth, forced to turn and display herself from every angle. Some spectators, emboldened by anonymity and the thin line between curiosity and cruelty, reached out to touch her buttocks, treating her as though she were an animal up for auction. Human zoo wasn't just a metaphor here. It was a business model, and Sarah was the exhibit. In between, her silent pacing handlers would step forward, narrating to the audience. They spoke of her strange features, describing in clinical detached terms the shape of her hips, the fullness of her lips, the darkness of her skin. They theorized about her place in the so-called great chain of being, debating whether she was closer to ape or human, a conversation delivered as scientific truth to an audience that devoured every word. They turned racism into science, and science into entertainment. Outside the exhibition halls, London's newspapers churned out stories, some tinged with curiosity, others dripping with scandal. They printed sketches of Sarah exaggerating her figure, fueling the city's appetite for the shocking truth about this woman from Africa. Meanwhile, rumors spread in taverns and coffee houses, tales told and retold until Sarah Bartman became a household name, though few ever bothered to say her real name at all. But even in a city driven by profit, not everyone turned a blind eye. The growing abolitionist movement, already battling slavery across the British Empire, recognized that what was happening to Sarah was a different kind of bondage. To them, her exhibitions were not entertainment, but a violation of human dignity, a cruel extension of the same racial hierarchies they sought to destroy. In 1810, the African Association took legal action on Sarah's behalf, accusing her handlers of indecent treatment and forced exhibition. The case sparked controversy, drawing public attention to Sarah's plight. The question at the heart of the trial was simple, yet devastating. Was Sarah Bartman performing by choice or under coercion? Old courtroom sketch Sarah sitting silently surrounded by men in wigs arguing her fate. But the courtroom was no sanctuary. Sarah was coached to say she participated willingly, that she earned money, that she could leave whenever she wished. Whether those words were truly hers or forced upon her by men who controlled her life remains one of history's most haunting unknowns. The court, perhaps unwilling to confront the deeper truths of racism and exploitation, accepted her testimony at face value. They asked if she was free, and believed her answer, because it was convenient. The result was a cruel irony. Legally, Sarah was declared a willing performer, but her exhibitions continued cloaked in a thin veil of consent. Nothing truly changed except the illusion that her degradation had been given the blessing of the law. Outside the court, the crowds kept coming. They still paid their 2 shillings. They still reached out to touch. And every ticket sold turned Sarah's body into profit for everyone but her. And perhaps, in the rare quiet moments, Sarah wondered if escape was ever truly possible. Perhaps she stared into the faces of the men who claimed to protect her and saw only more bars on a gilded cage. For her, London was not the stage of freedom she'd been promised. It was a prison where every stare carved deeper wounds into her dignity. Sarah Bartman survived the court, but she could not escape the stage. Yet even as the lights of London dimmed, another stage waited across the sea, a city that called itself the cradle of art and reason, but would prove even more merciless. Because Sarah's journey was far from over. Her next destination was Paris, a city ready to turn cruelty into culture and exploitation into enlightenment. Paris, the city of light, a place that claimed to worship art, beauty, and the ideals of liberté, égalité, fraternité. But beneath the glow of oil lamps and gilded opera houses, Paris was hungry for something else, a hunger for the forbidden, the exotic, the spectacle of other people's suffering. When Sarah Bartman arrived in 1814, the city that called itself the capital of culture would prove even more merciless than London. London humiliated her. Paris devoured her. The journey to Paris was not a rescue, it was an escalation. After the controversy in London, her handlers believed that the French public would be even more fascinated by the so-called Hottentot Venus. And they were right. Paris was a city obsessed with the strange and the untold story behind foreign faces and bodies. The French Revolution had not erased racism, it had simply dressed it in the language of science and progress. The man who took control of Sarah's fate in Paris was a showman known as S. Rayo. His business was animals and curiosities, trained bears, rare birds, and now a woman whose very body had become Europe's dark fascination. Rayo wasted no time in exploiting Sarah to her physical and psychological limits. Sarah was forced onto stages in both grand salons and filthy sideshows. Sometimes she was made to perform before elegant aristocrats in silk gowns. Other times she stood before rowdy working-class crowds who screamed insults and laughter. She was displayed nearly naked, wearing little more than a small apron that barely covered her genitals. The supposed thin line of decency that had existed in London dissolved completely in Paris. There was no pretense of modesty here. Her body became a living map upon which the French projected every racist fantasy they'd ever held. Candle-lit stage close-up of Sarah's eyes looking downward, beads of sweat on her skin, muffled crowd noises swelling. The audience gawked. They whispered in horrified delight. They reached out to touch her skin to confirm that what they saw was real. And above it all loomed the voice of the handlers narrating her measurements, her so-called primitive traits, repeating the same phrases over and over like a twisted litany. The goal was not simply to show her body, it was to convince the public that Sarah Bartman was proof of Europe's superiority, that she was a link between man and beast. Paris called it science, but it was nothing more than cruelty in costume. Yet the worst was not the crowds. The worst was the gaze of men who wore powdered wigs and carried notebooks. Because among those who came to see Sarah was Georges Cuvier, one of France's most renowned naturalists and a founding figure in comparative anatomy. To Cuvier, Sarah was not a woman, she was a specimen. Cuvier and his colleagues subjected Sarah to extensive examinations while she was still alive. They measured the curves of her hips, they catalogued the folds of her skin. They sketched her naked form from every angle, creating anatomical drawings destined for scientific publications. Each measurement was a line drawn between her humanity and Europe's narrative of African inferiority. The same intellectuals who celebrated Enlightenment ideals of human rights saw in Sarah Bartman nothing but data points to prove a lie. They reduced a woman's body to numbers and called it enlightenment. Sarah's physical and mental health began to deteriorate under the relentless strain. The endless exhibitions, the cruel stares, the invasive examinations all took a toll. She turned increasingly to alcohol, perhaps the only escape from her daily humiliation. Contemporary accounts describe her growing distant, her eyes dimming, her performances becoming mechanical. The woman who once sang songs from the Eastern Cape was fading piece by piece. Slow fade from images of Sarah on stage to her sitting alone in a dark corner clutching a bottle. While Europe applauded itself for its scientific racism, Sarah was dying in plain sight. Paris had promised her glamour and respect. Instead, it offered degradation more ruthless than anything she'd known. Her presence fed the city's obsession with the exotic, the erotic, and the myth of white supremacy. She became a symbol twisted into something monstrous by those who refused to see her humanity. Sarah Bartman was no longer a person. She was Paris's favorite nightmare. Yet even in this city that claimed to worship art and philosophy, there were whispers that what was happening was wrong. A few voices murmured about dignity, about the line between science and savagery. But those voices were drowned out by the roar of the crowds and the turning gears of profit. And so Sarah remained on display. Night after night, stage after stage, until the performances stopped, not because Paris found its conscience, but because Sarah's body could no longer endure the weight of Europe's curiosity. Her suffering was far from over. Because in Paris, death would become just another chapter in the dark history written upon her flesh. And the man waiting to carve that final chapter was none other than Georges Cuvier himself, a man determined to claim Sarah's body as the ultimate prize in his pursuit of so-called scientific truth. By the winter of 1815, the brilliant lights of Paris grew colder for Sarah Bartman. The cheers of crowds had faded into a mechanical routine. Her body exhausted, her spirit dimmed. Night after night, she had been paraded as an object of fascination and derision until the same city that once demanded her presence now stood by as she withered away. Sarah was around 26 years old, a young woman whose life had been carved into pieces by the knives of empire spectacle and scientific racism. Sarah didn't die of disease alone. She died of Europe's cruelty. Officially, the cause of death was recorded as inflammatory and eruptive disease, perhaps pneumonia or tuberculosis. But history knows better. The relentless grind of exhibition, the invasive examinations, the psychological torment, and the ceaseless reduction of her body to a living curiosity all combined to destroy her from the inside out. In her final days, alcohol had become her only refuge, numbing the pain of a life where she was never allowed to belong to herself. Candle guttering in a dark room, slow fade into Sarah lying still, her face half-shadowed. Yet even in death, Sarah Bartman would not find peace. Within hours of her final breath, Georges Cuvier, the celebrated French naturalist who had already studied her like a specimen, claimed her body for science. To Cuvier, Sarah was no woman, no human soul laid to rest. She was the ultimate opportunity to confirm his theories about racial difference. He wasted no time transforming her death into yet another act of violation. They stripped her humanity in life. In death, they stripped her flesh. The scene inside Cuvier's lab must have been chilling. A marble slab, the cold glint of scalpels, jars of spirits waiting to preserve whatever secrets he could extract. Cuvier performed a meticulous autopsy, dissecting the very features that had become the obsession of Europe. He removed Sarah's brain, carefully measuring its weight and volume, searching for proof that black Africans were closer to apes than Europeans. He then turned his attention to her genitals, a focus so obscene that it reveals far more about European sexual fixations than it ever did about African biology. Cuvier's notes describe these parts in excruciating detail, a grotesque blend of clinical language and voyeuristic obsession. His conclusions would fuel decades of racist doctrine weaponizing science to justify subjugation. Flickering candlelight over anatomical drawings, Cuvier's gloved hands tracing lines on parchment. Her body became a battlefield where science fought for the right to call her less than human. From Sarah's flesh, Cuvier created a plaster cast of her body, ensuring that the Hottentot Venus would live on as a visual specimen. He preserved her skeleton, suspended her bones for display. He placed her brain and genitals in glass jars of formaldehyde, floating trophies of Europe's supposed intellectual conquest. It was not simply an autopsy. It was the final act in a theater of exploitation that had begun the moment Sarah left Africa. To the French scientific community, Sarah's remains were not evidence of cruelty. They were artifacts. Cuvier's report was presented to the French Academy of Sciences, where he described her anatomy in words that stripped away any last trace of her personhood. He declared that she was closer to apes than to humans, a statement seized upon by racists across Europe as scientific proof. Cuvier didn't just dissect Sarah Bartman's body, he dissected her humanity. Sarah's body, once a vessel of dreams and songs, became an object lesson in the pseudoscientific theories that would justify not just colonial rule, but slavery and apartheid for generations to come. Every measurement Cuvier took, every word he wrote was used as ammunition in the fight to keep black people at the bottom of the world's hierarchies. Perhaps the most grotesque truth is this: Cuvier's dissection wasn't seen as an atrocity. It was celebrated as progress. Scholars praised his work. Museums clamored for the chance to display Sarah's remains. For over 150 years, school children, scientists, and tourists would stand before her bones, reading plaques that described her as an exotic curiosity, never as the woman she truly was. Slow pan across empty glass jars, museum labels describing Hottentot Venus. Sarah Bartman's body became Europe's most shameful souvenir. Even death could not liberate Sarah Bartman. She was transformed from a living woman into a relic, a weapon wielded by science to carve a permanent wound into the dignity of Black people worldwide. And so she lingered behind glass, silent and stripped of identity, as the crowds who once paid to touch her flesh now paid to stare at her bones. But the story did not end there, because the same Europe that reduced her to an exhibit would centuries later be forced to reckon with what they had done. A battle was brewing, a fight to bring Sarah Bartman home, to give back to her, if not the life she'd been denied, at least the dignity that centuries of exploitation had stolen. And that battle would become the next chapter in this untold story of dark history, resistance, and the long road toward justice. For Sarah Bartman, death was supposed to be the end of suffering. But for over a century and a half, her body continued to perform on a different kind of stage, a silent stage of glass cases, museum halls, and scientific lectures. Instead of applause, there were whispers of curiosity. Instead of freedom, there was the cold gaze of countless strangers. In death, Sarah Bartman became Europe's most enduring exhibit. They caged her in life. They caged her in death. At the Musée de l'Homme in Paris, her plaster cast stood immortalizing every curve that had once been the source of both fascination and mockery. Her skeleton was suspended like an artifact, stripped of skin, but not of shame. Nearby, floating in glass jars of formaldehyde, rested her preserved brain and genitals, grotesque trophies of a science determined to prove the inferiority of Black bodies. Visitors could gaze at these remains, read the plaques, and feel they were witnessing a piece of truth. But the truth was, what they were looking at was the aftermath of racism disguised as science. Slow pan across dusty museum shelves, flickering lights illuminating Sarah's cast glass jars, casting eerie reflections. For over 150 years, Sarah's remains were not hidden in archives. They were out in the open on display for tourists, students, and scientists. School trips walked past her skeleton. Textbooks cited Cuvier's studies as evidence of racial hierarchies. Generations of Europeans were taught to see Sarah Bartman not as a woman, but as a specimen, a chapter in the dark history of Western science. Her body became propaganda used to justify colonialism, slavery, and apartheid. She was turned into a permanent reminder of the lies that kept empires alive. Sarah Bartman wasn't just dissected, she was weaponized. It's easy to imagine that only cruel men peered into those glass jars, but the tragedy is deeper. Entire families strolled through those museum halls. Lovers on dates paused to stare. Scientists scribbled notes, blind to the humanity behind the bones. The human zoo had simply evolved from a stage under gaslights to the polished corridors of academic institutions. And the message remained unchanged. Black bodies could be owned, displayed, and dissected for public consumption. Even the language used to describe her was a continuation of violence. Plaques and guidebooks labeled her as a specimen of the Hottentot race, a term soaked in colonial insult. Her measurements were recorded with clinical detachment. Her skeleton was categorized alongside animal skulls and relics from colonized lands. Her preserved genitals were described in anatomical terms that stripped away any semblance of dignity. Each word chosen by curators and scientists was a small blade slicing away what remained of her personhood. Every label in that museum was another chain around her memory. Yet the irony is almost unbearable. The same European institutions that proclaimed the values of reason, enlightenment, and human rights were the ones who displayed her body as evidence of Black inferiority. They called it science, but it was exploitation, the longest-running show in Europe's history. Over time, Sarah Bartman's story faded from public consciousness, even as her remains stayed on display. People stopped questioning how she had ended up behind glass. Her image became a curiosity stripped of context, reduced to a footnote in true crime of history documentaries. But beneath the dust of decades, the pain of her exploitation still vibrated like a silent scream. Empty museum halls echoing footsteps close up on a plaque with Sarah's name. And then as the 20th century wore on, the world began to change. The winds of decolonization swept through Africa. The civil rights movement raged across the globe. New generations started to ask hard questions. Why is a woman's body still locked in a museum case? Activist poets and scholars began to speak Sarah Bartman's name once more, refusing to let her remain just a relic of Europe's past crimes. Her bones became a battle cry. Sarah Bartman's presence in the Musée de l'Homme was no longer just a curiosity. It became an accusation, a haunting reminder that even the greatest cities could be built on the bodies of the exploited. And while the museum lights continued to shine on her cast, the darkness of what had been done could no longer be hidden. Because outside those glass cases, a fight was gathering momentum, a fight to bring Sarah home, to bury her with dignity, and to reclaim her humanity from the centuries of dark history that had stolen it. The story of how that fight unfolded would become a new chapter in the untold story of Sarah Bartman, a chapter written not in measurements and exhibitions, but in justice, memory, and the power of finally saying enough. For nearly 2 centuries, the silent halls of the Musée de l'Homme kept watch over the remains of Sarah Bartman. Her skeleton stood in glass, her plaster cast frozen in a pose she never chose, and her preserved organs floated in chemicals that stank of formaldehyde and centuries-old arrogance. To most of Paris, she became little more than a curiosity, a footnote in textbooks, a dusty exhibit behind museum doors. But outside those walls, the world was changing, and Sarah's story refused to stay buried. Empires fall, but the ghosts they leave behind demand justice. In the 1980s, as the fires of anti-apartheid struggle burned across South Africa, poets, activists, and scholars began to speak Sarah Bartman's name out loud. They refused to let her remain trapped in European cabinets of curiosity. Her body, they declared, was not a specimen of science, it was a stolen daughter of Africa. Writers like Diana Ferris, whose haunting poetry gave voice to Sarah's silence, turned her memory into a rallying cry. Sarah became not just a victim of colonial exploitation, but a symbol of resistance in the fight to reclaim dignity for all African people. She became more than an exhibit. She became a revolution. Montage of anti-apartheid protests, poets reciting verses, African flags waving. These demands for justice were not abstract. South African leaders formally petitioned the French government, insisting that Sarah Bartman's remains be returned to her homeland. The call for repatriation grew louder each year. It was more than just about burying bones, it was about healing wounds inflicted by colonialism, about confronting the dark history that European nations had tried to hide behind velvet curtains and Latin names. But France resisted. Museum officials argued that Sarah's remains were important scientific artifacts belonging to the heritage of all mankind. This reasoning revealed how little had changed. Even in the late 20th century, powerful institutions still clung to the belief that they had the right to possess and display the bodies of colonized people. They said she belonged to science. South Africa said she belonged to herself. The debate raged across diplomatic channels and newspaper headlines. It became a global discussion about who owns the past, and whether nations built on exploitation were willing to admit the price of their empires. Some European intellectuals warned that returning Sarah's remains would set a precedent, forcing museums to empty entire halls of artifacts and human remains taken from Africa, Asia, and the Americas. And perhaps that was precisely why it mattered so deeply. Newspaper clippings spinning into frame with headlines like, "France refuses to return Venus." But Sarah's advocates refused to surrender. In South Africa, her story became part of school curricula, teaching children not just about her suffering, but about the power of reclaiming history. Her face appeared in murals, her name in songs. What Europe tried to erase was instead transformed into a powerful weapon of cultural identity. As the apartheid regime fell in the early 1990s, momentum built rapidly. Nelson Mandela's new government prioritized bringing Sarah home. The request was no longer just diplomatic, it was a matter of national pride, a symbolic act of justice. For South Africans, Sarah Bartman was no longer a tragic footnote. She was an emblem of all the indignities suffered under racism in history and of a future determined never to forget. They'd stolen her body, but they could not steal her story. Finally, after years of debate and international pressure, the French government relented. In 2002, nearly 200 years after her death, Sarah Bartman's remains were returned to South Africa. Her homecoming was not a simple burial, it was a state funeral attended by thousands. People wept, sang, and prayed. Leaders spoke of justice, of closure, of the need to honor those who had suffered so deeply under the boots of empire. Footage of South African crowds singing, carrying flowers draped in national flags, Her remains were laid to rest in the Eastern Cape, close to the land where she had first learned to speak dance and dream. At last, Sarah Bartman was no longer a specimen. She was a daughter returned to her ancestors. Her grave became a place of pilgrimage, a silent monument to resilience to pain, and to the unstoppable demand for dignity. She left as a captive. She returned as a queen. But the story does not end at her grave, because Sarah Bartman's legacy stretches far beyond the soil of South Africa. Her name has become a rallying cry in debates about museum ethics, cultural property, and the human cost of empire. And in every discussion about who owns history and who gets to tell it, her ghost still whispers one question: when will justice finally be complete? Because Sarah Bartman may be home, but the fight for truth, dignity, and reparations continues. And that battle is the heart of the next chapter in this untold story of memory and resistance. Sarah Bartman's story didn't end in 2002 when her remains returned home, because her true legacy lives on in every question we ask about who gets to be seen as human, who gets to tell history, and who profits from the bodies and suffering of others. Her life was a stage built from gaslights, greed, and scientific arrogance, and the echo of those footlights still rings today, reminding us that the line between spectacle and humanity is razor thin. Sarah Bartman's cage is gone, but the eyes that built it are still among us. We live in an age of algorithms and viral videos where curiosity spreads faster than truth. Yet the same dangers remain: the reduction of human beings to objects, the packaging of pain as entertainment, the untold stories hidden behind bright thumbnails. The world still hungers for the exotic, the scandalous, the dark history that can be consumed in seconds. And so Sarah's story is not a relic, it's a warning. But there's another truth. Knowledge is power. When we speak her real name, when we learn her story in full, we break the cycle that kept her silent for 2 centuries. We refuse to let the legacy of racism in history remain buried beneath glass cases and polite silence. We declare that human dignity is not negotiable, that no body belongs on display, and that no woman should ever be turned into a cage. The most radical act we can do for Sarah Bartman is to remember she was human. If you felt something while watching this, if your heart ached or your fists clenched in anger, that means her story has power even now. Don't let it end here. Share what you've learned, speak her name, and help keep alive the truth that she was never simply a curiosity. She was a woman who deserved a life free from cages. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What part of Sarah Bartman's story hit you the hardest? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters, because history belongs to all of us. If you found this story powerful, save this video so you can revisit Sarah's journey and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more deep dives into the shocking truths and hidden chapters of dark history, subscribe and join me as we bring more of the untold stories to light. Because the fight for dignity didn't end with Sarah Bartman. It starts with us.